In this video, we're going to discuss web APIs. API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's common for a website like this to interact with a back-end system, a server somewhere, right? And so that server is the application, and your web page has some sort of interface to interact with it. So it's common for single page web applications, you sometimes hear those called SPAs, to be developed in such a way that it will make certain calls to your backend server as it needs more data. Okay, now APIs often have two-way communication. You can submit data and modify your backend system might interact with the database or something to that effect, and you can add data, sign up for a username, etc., have a cart, purchase things, all sorts of things like that. So there's this backend software application that you can interact with, right? And that's API, Application Programming Interface. So what we've done here is we've made a simple API. This one's read only. You cannot interact with it in a writing way, but the idea here is just as simple as possible to showcase how a single page web application might request information as it needs it. We kind of call this lazy loading. All right, so this is Fakebook. All of the data on this page is completely fake. All right, so I created a whole bunch of these users. This is similar to something that you might see on some web page where you have a bunch of user information. Obviously, you probably wouldn't have personally identifiable information on the page, but the idea here is just to play around with an API. Okay, so the idea here, what I did is I found this really cool AI face generator. So this is at perchance.org, AI face generator, and it you can click this randomize button, and it will randomly pick something, and then you can modify it a little bit if you want, and you can click generate, and it'll generate some images that are just AI generated faces. So it's pretty cool, and since we have this technology, I went ahead and generated several of them, and then I combined that with the Linux rig command. So this is random identity generator, and it creates a random identity for fictional data. So this is really handy for just this type of thing when you want to play around with some data. And so it gives random identities, and it gives an address, and it X's out the numbers. I went ahead and added them. I randomized all of that, so it's all fake information. None of these are real people. The images are AI. Okay, so you could make something like this if you wanted as well. All right, so what I've done is on the CS server at Indiana State, I have a directory called fake people, and I have an API in here. Now I've made this static JSON. That's not normally how applications, web APIs would be developed, but again, the point here is just to interact with this information using the fetch API. All right, so the URL to this is API and then users.json. So this is going to give us a JSON object, and it's a list of data. Okay, so when you're interacting with the web API, a lot of the times, most of the time, it's going to be some JSON data. It might be XML, something like that, but most of the time, JSON. And then it's not uncommon for there to be sort of this section of metadata in the response. Okay, so I have typed in a URL here in the web address bar, and that's making an HTTP GET request to get a document, right? So that's what the HTTP GET verb means. There are other HTTP verbs if you wanted to modify a document or add a new document, etc., but we're going to just stick with GET to start with. And the HTTP verb GET, when I pull this down, this is just a text file, just like when you pull down an HTML file. But the browser, when it sees an HTML file, it knows you want it to render that HTML file. With the JSON file, it just displays it in your browser. Okay, so when we go to this URL, we do an HTTP GET, and then we get this JSON blob back, which is just a blob of data. And again, as I said, it's not unusual for an API to have a little section of metadata. So this is just stuff about the API. And then this is the actual payload, right? So we made a request for users, right? And so here is the result of that request. So these are the items that I actually want. And this is just a list of users. Okay, so if I go back to my page here, if I click on one of these, I get a list of these, a full name and then a user ID. Okay, so we have a full name and then a user ID. All right, now there is more data for each one of these specific people, but what we're doing here is called lazy loading. So I get all of the information that I need to begin with. I just get a name and then an ID, and then as I click on one of these, I can go and request more data. All right, so if I open up my developer tools here and I look at network, okay, if I click on one of these that hasn't been opened yet, we should see some requests getting made. Let me close this. So here we got some requests being made. If I close this again and open it, we don't see any network requests because I'm caching this data. The information that I get back, I'm caching it, which means like temporarily storing it in memory so that I don't have to go get it again. I don't want to have to keep downloading stuff that I've already downloaded, right? It's sort of a waste. So when I click on a new one, right, we get new information. This is the username, or I'm sorry, this is the user's ID. So this is the user information where we get all of this information. And then there's also an image associated with this user. So it's the user ID and then .jpg. So these are the two network requests that are coming back. And again, as I close and open again, we don't see another network request because in the application, in the front end application, the client here, I am saving that in memory so I don't have to keep loading it. All right, but every time I click on one of these, we lazy load the information as it's needed. I go and get it, and then it renders in the page. Right, so you can see all of these neat AI images that are created. All right, so this is kind of neat, and it's again the idea here. This is all fake data. It's just a way to play around with fetching data like you would in a single page web application. Okay, so looking at your network tab is pretty helpful for analyzing how a page works. All right, so when we reload this page, and when we initially reload, we see that we get some initial data that we pull down. So the initial document that we pull down is the index.html, right? And this is pulling down the various parts of that. We have the style, app.mjs, so I used a JavaScript module, and then that app.mjs, that JavaScript actually makes a fetch call to users.json and gets this list of information, and then that list is sorted and then rendered. Okay, so as we see here, this is the blob of data that I would get back, and notice it's not in alphabetical order, right? We've got, H's, T's, another H, right? So we had to do that manually. All right, so here is Tara Ashley, and this is the ID for that individual person. So I'm gonna copy that, and we're going to look at we want to look at the user ID JSON. All right, so our URL is cs.idstate/tilde-lma1/apis/fake people, and then so that's the route to. There's an index.html file here that is showcasing the API. All right, so if we want to use the API, we go into a folder called API, and then we have users.json. So this is initially the thing that is fetched, and we use that to render the list of names. Okay. If we want to look at a single user, we say users, and then we have a user ID .json. Okay, so that's what user URL example is. Okay, so this is the URL user ID.json. Okay, so we replace user ID in all caps with that user's ID. Okay, so if we click on this, I'm going to do this in a separate window, actually, so we can keep all clicking back between them. All right. Get the user ID. All right, enter. Okay, so this is what the user ID JSON blob looks like. Again, we have some metadata about the API request, which is common on some of these, and then you have some sort of variable that holds the payload that was requested. So what was requested here, according to the URL, we requested a user, and it was a specific user, so we passed in the ID. So this should be the expanded version. It's a deep copy, a detailed copy of the user information. So this is all the information that we see when we click on one of these items, right? So here is Ashley or Tara Ashley, and here's all that information. So this all comes from the second request that we made to get this blob of data. All right. Now the first request again is the list of all of the names. Second request is this blob, and then we also want the image. Okay, so here's the image URL example, and we can see that the image is located here, but we replace user ID with this person's user ID. Okay, and so this is again the AI generated image. It's larger, but we modified everything with CSS. And this is not designed at all to look good. I'm doing like the bare minimum of CSS. We just want some functionality so that we can interact with something on the back end. That's the point of this. It's not meant to look good. Hopefully you make something that looks better. All right. So that's the premise of what we're doing. That's the API description, right? It's only basically two endpoints or two types of endpoints. There's the list users, and that gives us the entire list with all of the IDs, the full names and IDs, right? That's here. So this is an array. And then the other type of data you can get is a user detail blob, right? And this is the user details. And then the third thing is you can just pull down an image. So I can do this with just an image tag in the HTML that we create. All right, so let's make this. So we're gonna recreate this. Let's take a look at our text editor here, and we're gonna start with a simple HTML document. We have our doc type, language English, direction left to right. The head tag we have charset UTF-8, which is standard, and then we have a title. This is fake book. We have the body tag. H1, two H1s, welcome to fake book, and this is just to make sure everyone knows that this information is fake. It is not real. None of it is real at all. Again, completely generated. And then what we have here is a div, and I'm going to use this div when I pull down information from the backend service. I'm going to change the inner HTML of this div and fill it up with other content. Okay, so that's the premise. We're not going to be doing much more with this index.html. So let's start and move this over to the CS website. So because we're interacting with the web API, making fetch calls, where we need to be on the same server, otherwise we have to change our CORS settings, which is that is a safety protocol. CORS can get a little bit complicated, but the idea is you don't want an application you're building to be accessible, to be downloading things that it shouldn't be, right? So you have to enable certain things to be allowed over the network, right? And that's the whole idea with CORS. So let's move this over, this index. So here, I'm on the CS server, and I'm making another example. This is that file that I just made. We're copying this over. So you can put this, wherever on the CS server. The way the CS server is set up, you have a username and public HTML. Anything in the public HTML folder is served in your username. So here I have tilde username, and then this application is going to be called cs.indstate, or the URL is going to be cs.indstate / tilde lma1 / and then fakebook. All right, so there's our two headings. Everything is fine. So we want to add some stuff to this, right? We want to add some CSS. So let's add a CSS file, new file. We're going to call this style.css. All right, and we just want to add some really basic styles. All right, so style.css. So the star selector is going to grab every element on the page and make box sizing border box. That basically means when you specify a width, it includes the padding and the border in that width size. Then the HTML always starts with a little bit of margin, so we just make sure the margin and padding are 0. Body, margin, padding 0. We make a background color like a dark theme, dark mode, right? This is just kind of to make sure that the CSS is all working. Position absolute, width and height 100% of the screen, and then overflow auto. If there's extra content added to the body, a scroll bar will appear. All right. Page heading, you set the height of the heading, and then text align center, and then the page content. So the page content, remember, is sort of this div. This is like the stage. This is where all of our information that we request is going to be injected into using inner HTML. All right. So this is our basic CSS, and now we need to include this into our HTML document, right? So to do that, we need a link tag. What is the relationship of this link? This is a style sheet. All right, and then we need the href, and this is in the same folder as our HTML document, and it's style.css. All right, this is a void element, so I am self-closing it. There's no content. All right, and we should have some styles now. Now, again, the way my workflow on this is I'm coding up locally, and then I'm going to have to transfer my changes from my local project to the CS server, replace. All right, and then we reload. All right, so we've got CSS. Now we need to get JavaScript going. All right, so JavaScript, let's add a new file. I'm going to use JavaScript modules. I'm going to call this app.mjs. There are a couple of quirks with MJS, so you can use JS if you prefer. It's easier, but I'm trying to use modules as much as possible. So app.mjs, and I'll go into the differences. We need to add something here to let us know that the JavaScript is actually running, right? So we would want to kind of just add starting application or something like that at the top. So this is our JavaScript module. And then we go back to our index.html. And in order to include this, you just need a script tag. And we want the type to be a module. All right. And then we want to defer the loading of this module until the entire application, the HTML has been downloaded and processed, right? So we're going to defer, and then the source for this is the same directory as the HTML document, app.mjs. Okay, and the script tags, you do have to, even if you don't have any script in there, you do have to have an open and close script tag. All right, so you can't self-close this app. There we go. All right, so this should load up our app, but we're going to see that we encounter a little bit of a problem here, and it's because we're using JavaScript modules. So what happens is, let me refresh. Okay, here's the local tab. I'm moving all of this stuff over. Replace. All right, and then let's reload our page. Open the DevTools console. So we should see starting application here. Reload the page. I like to empty cache, harder to load just to make sure. It says failed to load module script. Expected a JavaScript module, but the server responded with a meme type of nothing. Right? Strict meme type checking is enforced for module scripts per HTML specifications. So this does not occur if I use just a regular JS file, but I am trying to use the JavaScript module specification. So if I were to get rid of this type module and just do an app.js and rename this like that. On the server, delete the MJS file and move all of this over again. All right, so you have to get used to the workflow. Whenever you make changes, copy everything over. All right, so now I can reload the page. App.js, did I not rename it? I did not rename it. There it goes. Okay, so it's renamed now. Let's delete that again. All right, app.js is on the CS server now. We reload. Okay, we do get that JavaScript running. Okay, so it is a little bit easier to just use regular JavaScript. I do want to stick to the MJS. If you can't get the MJS working, that's fine. All of this will work in a JS file. With one exception, if you're using the async functions in a regular JS file, you have to define some async function main and then call main, right? You cannot use async and await directly in the file like you can with a module. So that's the only difference. So you'll have to do this to wrap the main code, right? That's really the only difference. So we're going to switch back to a module. So let's rename this back to an MJS. All right. And then here we want to put type equals module again. All right. And then this is app.mjs. All right, so now we're back. We can delete that and move everything over. Copy everything and reload. Okay, and we're back to this error. All right, so the way to fix this error, what this is per the HTTP protocol spec, there are HTTP headers, which is basically metadata about the thing that you are requesting, right? So you send a request, an HTTP GET, and you get some information back, and there are HTTP headers on that request. Okay, so here app.mjs, there are headers. So this is the request method. It's an HTTP GET. All right. And here are the response headers. Okay, so these are basically key value pairs of information about the response coming back. So what we have to do is our HTTP server, so the CS server uses Apache, but whenever it's serving up a JavaScript module, it has to change the content type to text/JavaScript. Okay, so we'll see this here in a second when I change this. So since we're using Apache, the way to modify the settings on Apache is to create a hidden file in your web directory called dot, so it's hidden, that starts with a dot in Linux, ht access. All right, and then what we want to do is specify which module we want to interact with. So this is the meme type module, and we want to add type for files that end in a .json. We want to add the application/JSON content type, and then for files that are either JS or MJS, we want to add the text/JavaScript. Okay, and so we're going to save this file, and we have to move this over to the CS server. Again, this is for Apache, and this is how Apache can be configured on a per user basis. You create these HT access files. All right, and so we can go in here and move over our HT access file and go back to Fakebook and reload. Saved. Okay, looks like it's there. Okay, there we go. All right, starting application. And so the favicon is just the little icon here at the top. You can specify that. Most applications have their own little icon, right? It always, the browser always tries to request one of these, but I don't have one. So that's what this error is. But what works is the JavaScript, okay? And we are using the MJS. All right, if we were to refresh the page, here we have the MJS file, and we can look at the headers. And here we see content type now is text/JavaScript. Okay, so this is all in the specification, the HTML specification. If you're using JavaScript modules, your server has to include this. So it's an extra security measure, but it makes us have to jump through a few more hoops to use JavaScript modules. Now, if you just want to use regular JS file, that's fine. It is not required that you have this content type in there. All right, but just so we can use the latest stuff, we're using the MJS files. Okay. So again, and this gives us an opportunity to kind of explore the developer tools. Most people have seen the console and the elements. You can look at your HTML document. The console is where the JavaScript console.logs show up. You've got your source file, but network is really, really handy when you start dealing with a web application or a single page web app that is interacting with some back-end system. So you're going to start looking at all of this information periodically, right? Content type is one that you'll see a lot. Request method, HTTP. The status code is the result of the request. So whenever you make a request, the browser is making a request for this web page. This is a really index.html, right? So it's making a request to that page, that index.html. It does a GET request. And then if everything works, the web server has located the document that we were getting, and it sends back a status code of 200, right? And then it sends back the document as the payload. But sometimes we want to get JSON back instead of HTML. So this is an HTML file. We might want to get JSON back, right? So that's the idea. All right, so what else do we want to add to this thing? Okay, so let's start modifying our app.mjs. Okay, we're going to get some basic information here. All right, there's our htaccess. That's good. We don't need that. So here is app.mjs. All right, so the basic stuff we're going to need. So the API, we're going to be interacting with the backend system. So we need https cs.indstate.edu /lma1 API fake people. Now this slash index.html is the web page, right? But the API is a directory in there, so slash API. All right, so that's the base API. To get the user JSON, so this is the list of users. Notice it's plural, users JSON URL. We have API base URL, right? That's this up here. We add a slash after API, and then users.json. So notice we're using templating strings. These are really handy in JavaScript. Make sure you are using those. It makes everything a little bit easier to read. All right, so that is the user's JSON URL. The user's base URL, so this is for individual users. All right, so it's basically API base URL slash users, right? And then you would specify for a particular user slash user ID dot JSON. Okay, so we're gonna have to add that in, right? And then if I want an image, it's the user's base URL. So all of this, the API slash users slash images, and then also this is user ID dot JPEG. Okay, so that's sort of the system that we're going to use, and we got all that information from the original call, right? So this is the original API. This is the users.json. We got all this information here. I created the API, so I just know it. But if you need to look up where we got that information, this is just some metadata about the API itself, right? And I put some URLs in there. Okay, so we have sort of these constants. These should all probably be const. I'm just going to use let for everything for now. And then what do we have here? This is the alphabetical users list. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to grab all of the users, right? We have this list of objects, ID and full name, but they're not in alphabetical order. We want to sort those things, right? So we have to make a request to get this, and then we want to sort that. I'm going to store that in the alphabetical users variable. So I have to sort it first to store it in there. All right, so then this is when we grab an individual user, right? When we grab the detailed information, I'm going to make a user's map from that. All right, I could just make an object and add items to this object, but that's actually not a good use of the JavaScript objects. JavaScript objects are generally supposed to be things that are of a particular type, and you don't want to add and remove properties a lot. People do it all the time, but it's not the most efficient thing. It's more efficient to use the map data structure. So map is specifically designed for adding and removing items to it on a regular basis. So we're gonna try to use some better practices here. So here, this is what it is, the users, and then this is an ID map, right? Here, this is the alphabetical users list. All right, so let's take a look at how we're gonna do this. So the main part of our code is going to fetch the user's JSON. All right, so we can say something like let fetch result and we learned about the fetch API, and we want the user's JSON URL, right? So we want to fetch that. Now remember, the fetch API returns a promise. We're using a JavaScript module, so we can go ahead and just await right here. If you're not using a JavaScript module, you would have to build the function async function main. You can call the function whatever you want, like this, and then call main, and it should work just fine. Put everything that we're doing in this module, we put that in here. All right, but we're in a JavaScript module, so we don't need to do that. So we can use await. So what does await do? It basically unwraps a promise. It makes it appear to be synchronous code, right? So fetch result unwraps the result of fetching this promise. We're going to get the API result. So we are expecting a JSON blob, users.json, right? So API result, I'm going to say, is wait. So after you get this fetch response, if you want to parse this as JSON into a JavaScript object, you can say fetch result .json. Okay. So this also returns a promise because parsing things takes a certain amount of time. So they try to make this asynchronous. All right, so we have this API result. So all of our API requests, we're going to have this sort of standard thing. You call fetch, you get a result, which is basically the fetch response. And then you want to parse the data that you get back somehow. So it could be text, right? You could do something like that. We actually want JSON, and it's going to just parse this into an actual object for us. Okay, and that's our API result. Now remember, there is metadata on this API request. So let's log this out, and we look at API result here. All right, so we haven't added much JavaScript. Let's move everything over and test it. Okay, so locally, we're going to just select everything, move it over to the CS server, and then we go back to the page we're working on, empty, and reload. All right, let's look at the console. And so we do indeed get the API, right? So this is sort of the metadata that we get back, and then we get this data. All right, so this is nice. We are actually getting this JSON blob back, and now we have an object. So this is the start of professional web development, right? Interacting with a backend system, it's absolutely critical. You use fetch to get data from your backend system. And now we can do something with this data. Since we have a list of these items, we can go through this list, and we can sort the list, but then we can also create in a for loop, go through each one of these objects and create HTML blobs in here. Okay, so let's see what we want to do there. First, let's save this API result. we actually want the alphabetical users list to be the API result dot data, right? So we don't really care about the metadata right now. We want the actual data from the request, right? We wanted the users list. All right, so here is data, but now this is still not sorted, so we want to use the JavaScript sort method, right? So the way the JavaScript sort method works is you pass in a function, all right, and then the function takes in two values, A and B, and these are essentially two elements in the list, right? And then what you want to say is if you return a -1, that means A should be before B. If you return a 1, that means B should be before A. All right, so how do we want to check this? We can say if A dot full name comes before B dot full name. And when you're comparing strings in JavaScript, it does an alphabetical comparison. So this is how you can kind of just compare two strings to see if one comes before the other one alphabetically. And so if this is true, if A comes before B, then we do want A, the specified order of these should be A and then B, so that means we return 1. Or I'm sorry, -1. Now you can look up the JavaScript spec on sort. Array.prototype.sort, and it talks about all of this. You got months, you can call .sort, and by default it will just sort them because they're strings, but we have complex objects. So if you have a complex object, you want to pass in a comparison function, right? And then A is the first element, B is the second element. It can never be undefined if you want this to work. And then, so comparing A and B, the return value, if it's greater than 0, right? That means if it's like a +1, A comes after B. If it's a -1, A comes before B. And then if it's 0, just keep whatever the original order is. All right, so that's why this comparison works. All right, let's go back to our code. We have this list of things that are sorted. Sort A, B. There we go, alphabetical users. And let's log this out, console.log, and make sure it is alphabetical. And we don't need that anymore. All right, let's move stuff over. Oops, it's not. There we go. All right, so we have a list of items. So here, Allison is the last name, Harriet, Ashley, Tara, right? So the reason I did a.fullname is because when we looked at the original JSON blob, right, this is the list of users. So this would be A, and then this might be B, right? So we want to sort by a.fullname and compare that to b.fullname, right? So that's the idea. And then the way that looks is here, indeed, it looks like everything is alphabetically sorted, right? So that's nice. We do have everything saved alphabetically. Now what do we want to do with this? We want to generate some HTML. And remember I said we have this page content div. So I want to grab that page content div, right? And I'm going to grab the HTML that's inside there if there is any. There isn't, but it's just a good habit. Like if I'm going to append the information to the HTML element, I would want to grab it and get the HTML out, right? So document.query selector, I want to select the first element on the page that has the class page content, right? I'm going to grab that. We don't need this anymore. So this is my my stage element, right? So I could console.log this. Reload. All right. Page content. All right, let's put something in there so yeah, we'll print that out. All right, let's try this again. Reload. Okay, so there is our element. All right, that's the inner HTML. Rather, not the element. This gives us the element, and then inner HTML is the HTML inside of that. Right now, the only HTML is just this text. Okay, so that's what we're going to start with, and we're going to call this just HTML. So this is some HTML that's going to eventually go back into this element, right? Let's call this content element. All right, so we got the HTML from that. And then what do we want to do? Well, we want to add some stuff to that. So let's add an HR tag at the beginning. So that's a horizontal rule. That gives us all of these little lines, right? It's a quick way to do that. So horizontal rule. All right, and then what else do we want to add? We want to iterate through our users. Okay, so let's make a for loop. We can say for, and we want to iterate through an array. So this is an ordered list. So let user, it's an ordered list. So we say of, right? If it was an object, you would say in. So that's the way I remember it. Arrays are ordered, so you have of. So let user of alphabetical users lists. That is our for loop. And what we want to do is we want to basically grab an individual, I guess we'll start by, we want to add HTML, basically just print out the full name of each person, right? So we want to do something like this. Okay, so I'm using this HTML, right? This we added the horizontal rule. Now I'm going to add to this plus equals. So for every single one of these users, I'm going to add some more text to this HTML. And this is just string data for now. But then I'm going to put this HTML back on the content element. So I'm going to say content element dot inner HTML down here, and set that equal to this HTML now that I've modified it by adding all of this extra text in there. Once I do this, that means the browser is going to have to re-render all of this new HTML. Okay. So what are we adding in here? So I basically want a div for each one of these individual users. Okay. So I'm going to put an ID on the div for each one of these, and that's so I can grab this particular section of the application, the client. I want to grab that particular div when I have a user ID, because that's the thing I have to modify. I want to add more information here, so that's why I want to put the ID of the person there. So I want to be able to grab it later. Okay, so this div has the same ID as the user, right? And then I'm putting a class on this. I'm just calling this a card. All right, that's a common thing you might do, a CSS style. You have cards of information. So this is a little card, a little profile card of an individual. Okay, so class card, I can add that to my CSS if I want. And then I'm going to add an on click, and this is going to toggle the profile view. We don't really need that yet, so I could take that off for now. That's when we add the JavaScript. So when I click on one of these things, I click and something has to happen, right? So we'll leave that off for now, but we're gonna add that back in later. So this is the card for the user information. What goes inside? Here we have a div that's just the username. That's sort of the title, right? And then this second div is the expanded view. When you click, this is going to get populated with more information. Okay, so right now it's just an empty div, and we're going to do the inner HTML trick again. Okay, so this class is, we're going to call this the expanded view, and it has this HTML attribute called hidden. When there's a hidden attribute on an HTML element, it's hidden from the flow, right? So the browser does not render it. Okay, you can still have HTML in here, and we're going to see when we do populate this, what we do is we click on this. When I click on it again, I add the hidden tag. This HTML still exists, but it adds the hidden, I add the hidden attribute to it, and we see it's still here, right? And all of the information is still there. There's the image, and then there's all of this full name, all of the traits. It's still there, but it's not visible. Notice, like when I put my mouse over the div, you can't see it on the document, right? But when I click, now you can, right? Because it's in the flow again. And that's all from the hidden attribute. All right, so, and we added that on the expanded view, right? So the name always shows up, but then we add this expanded view underneath. Okay, so not too complicated. Every user card is a div, and then in that div there's the name, and then a div for more information. That's it, right? And then we add an extra horizontal rule. And the way I'm doing this, I'm using the HTML template strings, and I like to do it like this, where when I go into HTML land, I unindent everything back to the beginning, and then I just call trim, and that gets rid of these white spaces. But this is just so the code looks kind of nice and it's readable, and I can kind of read this HTML. All right, so this is sort of a nice way of putting HTML in your files. We're not using any libraries. We're not using React or Vue or anything like that to actually have, templates. So we're sort of using our own templates, and this is why it's called a template string. All right, so that is the HTML, and we're doing this for every single one of these users. All right, and then what we're doing is at the end, we're saying enter HTML. We're setting that to all of this new HTML text that we created. So there's our content element. That's the page content, right? So let's move this over and see what we have. All right. And we get this list of people, and they're in alphabetical order. All right, so that's really nice. Everything worked out fine. If you scroll down, though, I don't like that this is at the very bottom. I like to be able to scroll past the end, right? So this content can come up on the screen, and I'm not forced to look at it there at the bottom. So what I'm going to do is add an extra little div at the end. So HTML, I'm going to add one div, and I'm going to call this page end spacer, and we're going to go into our style.css and just basically give this a height of like 500 pixels, right? And then that allows me to kind of scroll past, because I have an extra bit of stuff at the bottom, and so I have to scroll down to see that. Even though it's empty, I can put that in there. And so page end spacer, and then we can move that over, and we can see that I get the effect that I'm looking for. And this is just sort of a little hacky way to get some extra breathing room on your scroll. So as I scroll down, there we go. So I can continue to scroll past, and that way the bottom item I can see a little bit more. All right, small little thing, that's fine. So these are the cards, and we're going to be interacting with these things. Right? So on a web page, usually there's an indication that you can click on something, and that is by changing the cursor, right? So if I want to change the cursor to a pointer, that is a subtle indication that most people know means that you can click on the thing. So I'm going to add a little bit more CSS here. This is the card class. right? I'm going to save that, and we're going to change the cursor to be a pointer, right? So again, that's for each one of these individual user cards. We want to, this is the class, the CSS class, so we're going to select those and change, when the mouse goes over it, the cursor changes to a pointer. All right, now we can take a look at that. All right, reload the page. All right, so this is the pointer, and this is the same cursor that goes over like links, right? So even if you are aware that this happens or not, like intuitively your brain knows when it sees this to click, right? So we want to add some click functionality to this. All right, so what happens when I click? All right, so I want to go back to adding that toggle profile view on click, right? So I need some sort of function here. When I click on one of these user cards, something should happen, right? I need to add some HTML, right? If we inspect this right now, we just have these two elements. We have sort of the title, right, the username, and then the expanded view, but that's hidden, but it's also empty. So what I want to do is the first time I click on it, I want to add all of that inner HTML in there, okay? And then if I click on it again, I'm just going to slap this hidden back on there. So the first time I click it, I have to take off the hidden attribute and then also add a bunch of inner HTML. If I click on it again, then I just want to slap on the hidden attribute and it'll go away. Then if I click on it a third time, I just remove the hidden attribute. I don't have to fill the HTML again because I already did that. I don't want to have to keep making network requests, right? So this is called caching. I make the request one time and then I keep it in memory, or in this case, I keep it on the HTML document, but then I can hide it, right? So you don't want to make too many network requests. You don't want a chatty application. You need a chatty protocol. All right, so let's do this. What does this look like? So I obviously need a toggle profile view function. So let's see what that might look like. Now, since we have an HTML module, the toggle profile view, this is actually has to be attached to the window object. So in modules, when you define a function, anything defined in the module is limited in scope. You don't have access to, this stuff isn't added to the global object. If I had just a regular JS file, it would be. So if I defined a function just in the global scope of this file, it would automatically be attached to the window object, right? And in order to access something from the onClick handler, you do need to attach this to the window object. Okay, that's the global object, right? So let's define what that is, right? So let's see, let's put this up here. This is sort of our main program. All right, and then we have window toggle profile view, right? And this is going to be on click. And let's just console.log something to make sure this is working. Toggle profile view, it worked. All right, move this stuff over. Reload the page. And then console, it worked. So I can click on these and then it worked. All right. Now it's important that I am able to access the right element though. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to get the target element. So I can say anytime an event occurs, right, JavaScript is single threaded, one event is processed at a time, and so there's always a target of that event. So every event has or almost every event is associated with an HTML element. You can access that. This is really the window.event object, right? It's global. But anything on the window object you can access by just typing its name, as long as there are no other variables named that in your scope, right? So event.target, so this is the currently executing event, and that is the target element. All right, and we can kind of look at this console.log target element. All right. Let's move this stuff over. Reload. Okay, so there's the div, username Alice. All right. Okay. Now, what's interesting here is this div is not where the onClick handler is. If I click up here a little bit, I don't know if it'll let me find it. So if we look in our HTML, right, the username div is here, and that's just saying that's what we clicked on. All right, let's inspect element, right? But I actually want to get this element, right, because that's what has the ID on it. Okay. Right, and so we see that these two elements are exactly the same size. So if I click on this, I'm actually clicking on this element. There's no way, since they're the exact same size, there's no way for me to directly click on this element. So what we have to do is go up and get the parent until we get the ID property, right? So this is the target element. So this is the element on which the event occurred. So it's the top level div, right? And we want to go up until we reach the one with the ID. So this is pretty simple to do. We just have a little while loop. While not target ID, then our real target element that we want to deal with is target element dot parent, and we keep going up to the parent until we get a target dot ID. So this is the attribute ID on that element, right? So if we added ID somewhere else, that we would have to change this logic, but the way we've set this up, it should be fine, right? So here is what we're clicking, and we're going to get the parent until we see an ID property on that parent. Now in this case, it's just one parent up, so we don't really need the while loop. But you could imagine maybe I put decide to wrap this in a div and do some other things. So I've got a little while loop here to do that. And so target element now should be the item with the actual ID. Right, so let's print out target element after we go through that. All right, let's copy everything over. Reload, click. Okay, so there's the username we clicked on, but then we went up and got the parent until it had an ID property. All right, so now we have access to that ID. So now we can make another fetch call, right, to get the detailed information of this user. All right, so that's the whole point of grabbing this div, because it's got the ID on there. Okay, so let's do this. We have we want to basically get the deep user information, or the detailed user information. So let's make a little function to do that. Assuming we have the user ID, which we do, that's, you know, dot ID, right? We want some little function that we can call, and we're going to call this get user detail. Okay, now this is going to be an async function, right? Because we're going to use fetch. All right, and just to make sure this is working, we're going to console.log maybe the user ID, right? And we're going to call this here get user detail. And we want target element dot ID. So we're passing in the ID. Now this is an async function, so we have to await the output. And eventually we're going to get back a user value, right? So some user, this is the a detail user. All right, so we get this data back. But let's see if it just logs this properly. reload the page, click, it worked. All right. User ID is not defined. Get user detail. Oops. There we go. I have to have the parameter. So I passed it in as an argument, so I have to have a parameter to store it in. All right. There we go. And reload. Okay, so there is the ID. So now what do we want to do? We basically want to get all the user information that we can, right? So we have we have some generic information already, or we should, right, from the initial list. So that just gives us the full name and the user ID. So let's go back and make sure that we are adding that to our map, right? We have this users map, and we got this alphabetical list of information, but we want to go through and make sure for each one of those items in that alphabetical list of information, we are keeping track of the data in a map, right? So why is this? This is a list. If I wanted to grab an individual user by ID, if we look at the blob, what I would have to do is I'd have to go through each and every one of these elements and check the ID property to see if it matches, right? And so if my person happens to be at the end of the list, I have to go through the entire list to find it. So this is not a good strategy for being able to access an individual user quickly. What this is good for is exactly what we used it for, listing things out in alphabetical order, okay? So what I want to do is I want to make the user ID map. I want to access objects based on the ID. So that's going to be the key. So whenever I have an ID, I can access the user. All right, that's the whole point. It's much faster to do it this way. Okay, so that's why we have this users underscore ID map. Right, this is just a new map. It's a key value store. All right, so what we want to do is when we are going through all the users in the list, let's go ahead and add something to our map. All right, so we're going to say users underscore ID map. We're going to set, so the key is going to be the user ID, and then this is just this is the shallow object, not the detailed object, because we're going through the alphabetical users list. So remember, that's just the list of the very small objects that we just looked at. It's a list of these objects. So this is a shallow object, user object, versus this is like the detailed object. Okay, so this is going to initialize our map to have all these users, and we can access them from the ID. All right, now what that does is that lets us, when we're back into our get user detail, right, we can use this user ID to access the ID that we already have and then add to it. Okay, so what do we want to do here? So our saved user is going to be what we have stored in this map. Right, so let's console.log saved user, just to make sure this is all working. Right, get user detail, we get the user ID from the div, and then we get the saved user that we already have stored in our map, and we're going to print out that saved user. Should just be a really small object. All right, let's move everything over. Reload, click. Small object, ID, full name. But it is that person. When I click on Ashley Tara, that is Tara Ashley, right? Robert Bauer, right? So everyone that I click on is that particular person. So that's good. That's exactly what we want. So we've got the saved user, but then we want to go out and get new information, right? So, but we only want to do this one time, right? So if there is something that we're getting from this blob of information, this blob, we can check for one of these properties. We already have an ID, so that's already going to be there, but we can check for one of these, like we could check for address. If that's on the object, then that means we've already made a network call to get this. Okay. If it's not on the object, then we haven't. All right. We can add that function later. Let's first just fetch the result. All right, so we've got this saved user. We want to fetch saved user. We need to add a data URL to this saved user. All right, so what does that look like? Saved user.data URL. So this is just the URL to access the information, the JSON for this particular user, right? So you have the user's base URL we have up here, right? So that's the entire API / users, and then we're adding a / user ID.json. And I'm just attaching this to the user just so we can use it later if we need to. All right. And then here, what am I fetching? Data URL. Right. So this is the user data URL. Now that is an asynchronous fetch. It returns a promise, right? So we can use await to unwrap the promise. We get the fetch result, and then we can convert this to an object, which is also a promise. So we want to do the API result fetch JSON. So that gives us the data, and let's just console.log this API result. Okay. Right, so we get user detail, you pass in a user ID, you get the saved user we already have, add a data URL to the object, and then we fetch the detailed information from the data URL. And then eventually what we're going to do is all of the information we get back from this API call, we're going to add it to this saved user object. All right, so we do this, move this over, replace, and reload, click. All right, so this was the shallow object. Now we did add the data URL to it, and then this is the deeper object we got from the API. Now notice, again, we have that metadata from the API, but this is the actual payload. This is the data. This is the actual thing that we requested, right? So this is the user information. So what I can do is I basically want to attach all of the stuff that I got back in that data blob, right? Everything in data, I want to attach to our saved user, right? So what I can do is I can say object.assign. So this is I can pass in the target object, which is a saved user. So this is the object that I'm going to change. It has some stuff on it, and all of the properties on the objects after this are going to be attached to this object. So if I pass in another object, basically what object.assign does is all of the properties from that second or third or fourth object get attached onto this target object. Okay, so the object properties that I want to attach to this one, remember, is the API result, and it's the actual data, right? The payload. We don't care about the .api, that's the metadata. We want the data. All right, and now we can look at our saved user. All right, reload. And here's our saved user, right? We've got all this stuff. We've still got our data URL, we've got our ID, and all the additional stuff from the detailed data. All right, and now this is saved. Now, one issue though is the way we have this set up. Look at the network. When I click on Harriet, each time I'm re-requesting this JSON. That's a chatty client. I don't want every single time I click, I don't want my server to have to send this information. It's already sent it, right? So I should be keeping this, right? So what I want to do is I want to check to see if my saved user already has one of these properties. And then if it doesn't, then I'm going to do the fetch. but if it does, I don't need to do the fetch, right? So if saved user dot address, right? So if this property is on the object, if it's not on the object, if there's no value here, then I need to go ahead and fetch all of this stuff. And then return saved user, right? Here's where I get the cached version that I have already from our ID map, right? So this could be, I could have already clicked on this and this could already be filled out with the details, right? If saved user dot address exists, then that means I've already performed this, right? So I don't need to do this again. So I would skip all of this if saved user dot address exists, and then I just return that user. Okay, so that's kind of a neat way to save some network calls. All right, and then we'll console.log outside of the if so we can see. All right, reload the page. Click on Harriet once. Oh yeah, I didn't move everything. There we go. Reload the page. Click. Now every time I click, I'm clicking a bunch of times and nothing is changing. However, every time I click though, I am getting the full user object back. Okay, so that's a way to prevent a chatty protocol. Your client shouldn't unnecessarily talk to the server because the server is handling thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of requests, right? Okay, so this is kind of cool way to get user detail information, right? Yeah, and let's go ahead and add the image URL on here too. We added the data URL. Let's say we want to add the image URL. So let's save user dot image URL, and that's going to be the user's our image base URL / user ID dot JPEG, right? Image base URL. Let's move that over. Replace. Reload. Click. Image URL. Let's grab that and check. And that is indeed the image. Okay, so that's good. So now we can use this when we want to load our image up in there. So everything we really need is now on this user's object. All we have to do is translate this information on this object into some HTML, right? And that's about it. We're almost done. All right, so we've got that. Get the user detail. Toggle profile view is the whole thing that started this, right? This is the click event. When we click on one of these items, we are toggling the profile view. In the finished product, when we click on this, we get more information. If I click on it again, it hides. If I click on this, we get more information. So we're toggling the profile view, right? And then toggling and untoggling, right? So that's the idea, toggling and untoggling. We go back to the code. We don't need the it worked anymore. We do have the target element. We don't need to print that out. We get the target element that has the ID, and we use that ID to get the user detail. So that's where we are there. But what do we want to do next? All right, so we've got the target ID. We've got the deep data. Now we need to kind of make some HTML. Right, so I'm going to attach this in the inspect here in this expanded view. Like right now it's hidden, but this is the thing that I want to attach the information to, right? So this is the target element that I have has the ID on it. And this is its second child, so that would be the index of 1. Right? So I've got some HTML that I want to attach to this. So I'm going to just start with foo just to test this. And then I want to say my target element, I want to look at its HTML children. This, I want the second one. And I want to set the inner HTML to this to foo. Right? But then I have to do one other thing. I have to remove that hidden attribute. Right? Because right now if I just move this over, I wouldn't see anything rendered, even though the HTML would be changed. Let's reload the page. Click on this. I inspect. Click. Inspect. I didn't add foo. Did I not save that? I did not save it. That's frustrating. Okay. Move everything over. Replace. All right, reload. Now click. Now we don't see anything, but you saw that div light up there. That's because now there's content in it. It says foo. It didn't before. But we can't see the foo here because hidden. Now you can actually click on this and Chrome will let you delete that from there. And now you see foo. All right. So that's what we have to do with code. We have to remove that hidden. If I put that back, then that would be hidden. All right. So that's the thing that we have to do here at the end. We want to say remove attribute hidden. Right. So this is on the target element. Its children is a list of the children underneath it, the DOM elements. We want the second one. And we want to remove the attribute hidden. Okay. Now let's move all this over. Notice how often we're testing. It's really important. You do a small thing and you test it. All right. So we click on this. Foo. 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 All right. Now we want something more interesting. Let's console.log. The HTML maybe we can have here would just be the JSON object, which would be like, user. So if I want to make a JavaScript object a string, I can do something like this. And the number is the number of indentations. This is a filter effect. We don't want to do any filtration. And so here, we're just basically, when we click on this, we're going to add the JSON blob as HTML, right, instead of foo. Reload, click. All right, and so we do indeed see that's her information. That's her information. It's his information. Okay, so now we get a sense that we have enough to work with. We can make this work now. We've got all the network requests working properly. Okay, so all that we really have to do is modify this HTML to our liking, and then we're good. All right, so we need to change what, the HTML. Okay, so HTML then is not going to be this JSON object. We need to put actual HTML in there, right? And then we're going to do our trim off the white space. And what is the HTML that we want to put in here? All right, so let's say we have two divs. The left-hand div is going to have an image in it. So we have two divs that are like columns. Div class column / div, and we have two of these, right? And let's make our style. We're going to add column here and basically just sort of limit, we'll add some padding, and we want these two divs to display side by side, right? So we'll say width auto We want to add padding around each one of these. We want them to display side by side. So we're going to make the display inline block so they can line up next to each other. Divs by default are display block and they can't line up on the same line. Inline block allows them to do that. And then we're going to vertically align the content of these two divs to the middle so that everything's kind of centered. All right, there's a little CSS there for our column. We've got two columns. Again, the left-hand column is going to be the image. All right, so in here we're going to have an image tag. All right, so let's pop some of that in there. Again, this is a template string, so we can inject strings into it, right? So this is an image tag. Let's say the class for this is the profile image, so we'll modify the CS there. And then the source is going to be the user. And remember, we attached the .image URL to it. So now that I have access to this user object, right? I got the user detail. I have access to that. I can just say .user image, right? And so, and then this is profile image. So let's add this to our CSS. And we can maybe limit the size of those images because those images are a little bit big. We'll say height is 250 pixels or something like that. All right, reload. I need to move everything over. Now, this is not ideal for like professional development. I'm just showcasing the APIs. Ideally, we would have a whole dev environment set up and it wouldn't be this much of a hassle moving files all the time. But this is kind of how it starts. All right, reload. Click. And console. Let me get the data back. Okay, we are not getting the items. Let's inspect. Expanded view. Column. There's no image tag in there. It's because I did not save it. Very frustrating. All right, try this time. Reload, click. All right, so now we're getting images. And we can add the other stuff, but we can't close them right now. We can only open them. That's fine. We'll get to that part later. Let's finish up and put their stats over here to the right. All right, let's take a look at our code. That is going to be in this column over here. We want to go through in this column, and for every property in here, right? So we want to iterate over this. So we're going to say .trim, and we want a for loop here. And then this is going to be HTML plus equals. And there's the end of our div. Now in this for loop, we're going to add some more HTML. All right, so you see how I'm doing this HTML? It's like I'm keeping the indentation pattern. Here's some HTML. Here it is. And then in the for loop, we're going to repeatedly do some things that's going to go inside of this div. So the things that we're repeating is for let, this is called destructuring. Object.entries returns an array of an array of arrays. It's basically a list of the key followed by the value. So what I can do is destructure that into two individual values. So this is an array of arrays that have two values in them. Okay, so for each one of these, right, I could just say for item of object entries, this would then be object.entries is a list of keys and values in a list, right? But what I'm doing is destructuring that list of keys and values into key and value, right? So you don't have to do it this way, but this is, you'll see a lot of this in JavaScript. It's destructuring a collection of some kind, right? So we've got K and V, And what we want to do is add some HTML. Right, and then we've got our .trim. What is the HTML that we actually want to add? What's the indentation point, right? It's underneath this column. So we're going to have this back here. We're going to say we want to span. And this is for the labels. And then there we go. I'll get an extra space there. Okay, so that's the span for the labels, and then we want a span for the values. We want, let's see, we want a colon in here. We want the label is the key in the object. So user object, the key, colon. Then we want some spaces. So in JavaScript or in HTML, if you have a bunch of white space in a row, it collapses it down to 1. So if you actually want it to render multiple spaces, then you have to use the special HTML entity and non-breaking space. And you can have a regular space and then another non-breaking space, and you can do it like this and get a little bit of space in between, right? It would be better to use like Flexbox or something like this, but we're kind of doing this without a whole lot of complicated CSS. And then we have our values. What's our value? That is the V, right? So we have key from the object, value from the object. We're injecting those in here. And after each one of these spans, we have a BR tag to go to the next line. Right? Okay, and then maybe a new line character. But that's going to get trimmed off. It doesn't matter. All right, so let's save that, move this over, and see what we have. Click. All right, and we've got this information. This is nice. Now, the reason that this is all, this is below and they're not next to each other, if I right click and inspect, right, it's because this is too wide. If I zoom out, we see it go to the side. All right, it's really because of these image URLs and the data URLs. Technically, we probably don't want this in like a user profile. We wouldn't want the ID, the image URL, or the data URL. All the other stuff is fine, right? So let's filter that out. To filter that out, we just need a list of things that we want to kind of exclude, right? So we want to exclude the ID, the image URL, and the data URL, right? And so if our key is one of those things, right, then we'll just skip that one, right? So if the array to exclude includes the item at the key, right? So the key is ID, then what do? We just continue, right? So if you only have one bit of code in your if statement, you don't have to put curly braces around it, right? So that's what we're doing here. It's one line. So if that exists, then we continue. So that continuing in the for loop just goes to the next item in the for loop. So it skips the remainder, right? So let's do that. Move this over. Replace. Reload. And there we go. So this is, so I zoomed in and zoomed out. You can do that with Control- and Control+, or you can hit Control and do the mouse wheel. And in most browsers, that works. So now we see that it works, and we get this kind of nice effect because we're using inline block. When the width of the screen gets too small, then it just flows automatically nicely to the next line, right? And so that's sort of our effect. And now we're almost done. We just need to be able to toggle these back on and off, right? So how can we toggle the things off? we need some way of setting whether these are open or closed, right? So we're going to add another attribute to this main div here, right? This user div that has the ID. We're going to add another attribute of our own making, and we're going to call this toggle state. So you're allowed to include your own attributes as long as you have data hyphen in front of it. All right, it'll allow you to do anything, but that's the standard that you're supposed to put data hyphen, and then you can attach your own data properties. Now we used ID here because that is technically an HTML attribute that's allowed, and so there's nothing wrong with that, and there should only ever be one of these. So we went ahead and used the actual HTML ID attribute, and that's fine. There's no problems with that. But if we want to add custom information here, we should use the data hyphen attribute name. So we're going to have an attribute called data hyphen toggle state. Okay, so the toggle state is either going to be expanded or collapsed, right? So data toggle state. All right, so let's see how we can do this. Basically, we want to put this, we got to find the element that we want to put this on. So this is going to be in our main content here. Oh no, it's going to be up. It's going to be, yeah, toggle profile view. So every time you click, you basically, here we have toggle state, right, expanded. And when I click again, toggle state collapsed. I need to add the data on this one. All right, we're going to do it the right way over here. All right, so this is the element that I want to mess with, and that's every time you toggle the profile view, right? So let's go to the code to toggle the profile view. Toggle profile view. All right, and we're removing an attribute hidden from the target element, but we also want to add data toggle state, and it starts out as expanded the first time you click on this, right? Because the first time you click on it, we're having to fetch the data, right? And then when you click on it again, we want to add a hidden property here to the first child or the second child. Okay, so we need an if statement here. So we've got the target element, we've got the user information, and we only want to add this HTML if it's not already there. So how can we test to see if it's already there? That's why we have this. So if this already exists, right, and if it says collapsed or expanded, then we know we've already requested this data at least once. Okay, so if the expanded view was previously created, right? So if there is a data toggle state attribute, right? So on our target element, that's the one that has the ID on it. We get the attribute data toggle state. If that equals expanded, that means we've already grabbed the data, and we've already generated this HTML. So the only thing we have to do is remove a hidden attribute, right? So target element dot child one, or we actually want, if it's expanded and you're clicking, you want it to be hidden. So we want to set the attribute, and so this is just adding the attribute. If you put true here, that just adds it with no value. All right, and then we have to set the toggle state to collapsed, right? So this here, we want to set attribute, and we want to set it to collapsed. All right, so that's if the expanded view was previously created. And that's if it is already expanded. If it's not already expanded, that means it's collapsed. So, you know, if this attribute is on here, that means we've already filled out this information, right? And so if we get in one of these, we do this and then we return, right? So If this attribute exists and it equals expanded, that means we've already done all this stuff down here. So we just set the thing to hidden, change the toggle state attribute, and then return. If it's collapsed, then we want to remove the attribute hidden and set the state to expanded, and then return. Right? So that these are the two options if we've already created the expanded view. Right? So we only do this stuff once. Right? And we know if we've done it specifically because we added this additional attribute. So if this is on there and it equals expanded or collapsed, we know we've already done this part. Right? And that should be pretty close to all we need. Let's save this, move it over, replace, reload, click, 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 click. Look at the network, click, click. We're lazy loading, so we haven't done Terra yet. Click. So network did download these two things, and now we can keep clicking, and it's not downloading anything else. That's just a mistake from me highlighting. What I should do is add some no select text in there. All right, so anyway, I added a couple more things, just minor things to style. Let's see, we did username font size, we made it a little bit bigger, and the labels, font weight bold, right? I went ahead and added the other classes in there. Username font size 22 pixels, make it a little bit bigger. Font weight bold on the labels, and then values, you could do something like whatever you wanted. You could change the color slightly or add italics or who knows, right? But move all this over, and that's basically a single page web application, right? You're interacting with a backend system, retrieving data lazily as you need it, all right? And accessing multiple parts of the system, right? There's only two main endpoints here. It's the user's endpoint, which is the list of all the users. When it's shallow data, usually you have a list, it's shallow data. And then when you click on something, you go and get a deeper copy of the data, so more detailed data. All right, we reload, we see the names are bigger now, and we've got things highlighted. Right, so that is basically all you have to do to interact with a web API. This is about one of the simplest web APIs that you can get that is like reasonably meaningful, like it's something that you would do all the time in professional development. You would get a list of values. Now you would do this differently probably in a professional world. I'm trying to not use any frameworks, not use any templating. This is just pure JavaScript and CSS. But the idea is the same. Okay. So hopefully that was interesting and you learned a lot from that. Feel free to try to code this up, and that should be enough for this video. Thanks for watching. Let's take a look at the code one more time though. All right, so HTML file is really small because we were adding HTML dynamically with our app.mjs. Okay, so here is our stage. We're going to add inner HTML to that. Our styles, we had the basic stuff here. I'll scroll through slowly. All right, and then app.js, we had some sort of constants. These should all probably be const. When I'm developing, I like to just use let for everything until I know how everything's going to be stable. And then we have the alphabetical list, the user ID map, right? Get user detail. This only makes a network request if we need the data, if we haven't already saved it. So we're caching data, which is a good thing. This is the function that runs when you click on an item, right? So we get the target. We get user information. This will make a network request if we need to. If not, it just returns our cached copy of the user. If we've already generated the information in HTML, so if this attribute exists and it's expanded, then we toggle it to collapsed and hide that part of it. If it's collapsed, we toggle it to hidden. We remove that attribute, and data toggle state should be expanded. If neither of those is true, then that means we haven't made this HTML yet. All right, so we make this HTML, go through each of the properties on our object. We exclude a couple of items, ID, image URL, data URL, and then add in the basic information there. All right, then we set the inner HTML for that element. We remove the attribute hidden, and this is now expanded. So this is all for the very first click. Main program, and everything starts. We fetch all the users from the user JSON URL. We get a result. We turn that into JSON. We get this data. We don't care about the metadata, the .api. We want the actual data. Alphabetical users list. We sort. Right? If the sort function returns a -1, that means A should come before B. So if it returns a 1, it should be flipped. And then we just basically get this content element and then add some HTML to it, right? And this is just the primary list that we get when we first load the page, and we have this div in here that we're going to inject other information into and remove that hidden attribute. And then the htaccess file. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching.